to the steps of the National Assembly, of course, we'll be taking political reactions from the different political parties around what they think about this medium-term budget policy statement. First up in the lineup is Jordan Hill-Lewis, who is the DA spokesperson on finance. Firstly, generally, your thoughts on the medium-term budget policy statement?
Well, I'm afraid for all of the minister's tough talk about cutting debt and cutting the deficit, he didn't go nearly far enough. Debt is going to explode to more than 70% of GDP in the next 2 to 3 years, and the deficit's going to blow out to 6.5% next year. And that means that we're going to be spending more and more money on paying off our debt than ever before. In 2 years' time, we're going to be spending triple on debt than we do on policing and education and healthcare, and even more than we spend on social grants. Now, this is unacceptable. The minister has delayed the difficult choices once again, and despite the tough talk, we haven't seen the tough action. He hasn't stopped the bailouts to Eskom and SAA, and he hasn't cut the public sector wage bill like we asked him and suggested that he do. So unfortunately, as much as there's tough talk, there's no tough action.
Now, the biggest talking point coming into this budget is the issue of Eskom. The pronouncements made by him, are you happy that will be at least saving the entity so that it doesn't sink the economy?
Well, I think there's still a massive drain on the fiscus. He's announced another 33 billion rand in bailouts for Eskom, another 9 billion for SAA. And there's still no end in sight to the crisis at Eskom. They refuse to discuss selling coal power stations and getting Eskom to pay off its own debt. Instead, they're asking the public at large, the viewers of this show, to pay off that debt over time. And that is completely unacceptable. We are saying you are taking money from education, from healthcare, from police, even from social grants, and you're giving it to Eskom because you won't make the tough decisions, and that's not defensible.
All right, thank you so much. Jordan Hill-Lewis, he is, of course, the spokesperson on finance from the DA. I'm going to just take one more person, Studio Arabile. I'll bring in Steve Swart from the ACDP. Steve, your issue has always been about the government debt. Again, if the trajectory continues as it is, we'll be in big trouble.
Absolutely. We from the ACDP are very concerned about the government debt level spiraling out of control. One must bear in mind that indicated the debt is 3 trillion rand going up to 4.5 trillion rand in 2 years. Now that is totally unacceptable. And the reason for this is slow economic growth and wasteful and corrupt expenditure. That must be addressed. We need the economic stimulus package. We need the economic recovery plan implemented. We need the hard decisions to be made. And if we have economic growth, if we have wise tax collection, if we have prudent and good stewards of the state expenditure, then we will be able to balance our books. But at the moment, we see it spiraling out of control, and we are deeply concerned about the budget deficit that is increasing. In February, the minister said it will be 4.3%. Now we see 5.9% going up to 6.5% and then 6.2% in the medium term. And the debt service costs will reach 299 billion rand in the medium term. So we've got the harsh realities we have to face. We call on government to take the hard decisions to stimulate economic growth so that we can balance our books in the medium term.
What do you make of the pronouncements around keeping the salaries of MECs, cabinet ministers, as well as executive of state-owned companies still, or rather, being revised down?
No, absolutely. That is something that must be looked at. But in the broader scheme, the main problem lies with the public sector wage bill that is unaffordable, and that needs to be addressed. We need to ensure that the increases are inflation related, and of course we need to look at a reduction in the headcount, and there we're looking at voluntary severance packages and those issues. Eskom, SAA, we know have too many staff. That needs to be looked at because that is a main problem facing our SOCs. Besides the corruption and the wasteful expenditure, the large headcount, this must be addressed. And we as the ACDP have long said that if we give additional funding to the National Prosecuting Authority, the Hawks, the Special Investigating Unit, they can recover corrupt expenditure, cancel the contracts and lock up the corrupt people. That is what we from the ACDP require.
Steve Swart from the ACDP, thank you so much for your time. And I'm going to cross back to studio now where Arabali is standing by.
Bulelani, thank you so much for that. Yeah, indeed, a whole host of issues certainly coming out of that medium-term budget policy statement. Daniel Silk still joining us here as well in studio. Daniel, happy? Did he take the hard decisions? Steve Swart certainly thinks not. What are your thoughts?
Now, I didn't expect any hard decisions to be taken today. What I did expect was for the minister to try and change the narrative, to change the tone, to talk largely, I might add, to his own political party, which he did. He read the Riot Act to them in terms of the deep state, the dismal state of the domestic economy.
Sure.
And I think that message is probably the most important message of the afternoon, the seriousness that we find ourselves in. But he didn't need to say that to the business community. He didn't need to say that to the opposition. He needed to say that to his own political party.
Yeah.
And he's been very good at that in the past. He continues with that certainly this afternoon.
Yeah.
So if the message has sunk in to his own caucus that indeed business cannot continue as it has done in the past, if indeed we have to look at reconfiguring our state-owned enterprises, at cutting back on the public sector wage bill, if indeed the caucus and the party begin to understand that and accept that, then he will have got a tick from this afternoon's performance. But it doesn't ultimately address the hard-nosed political decisions that government still has to make. It's a statement of summary, a statement of intent more than anything else. And I think that's where the weakness lies, but the strength can still emanate from this particular afternoon in that the message can get home.
Just over 21 pages is how much the finance minister sort of shared with South Africa then when he comes to the MTBPS. We'll head on back to the steps of Parliament. My colleague Bulelani Phillips still getting some reaction.
All right, thank you so much, Arabile. We'll take more reactions on the steps of Parliament. I bring to you now Dr. Pieter Groenewald from the Freedom Front Plus. A difficult budget to present. Has it done enough to kind of appease the sovereign rating agencies?
No, for sure not. In fact, I think we have just witnessed the classical clash between the reality and ideology. The minister made a good analysis of what all the problems are in South Africa. But the problem is that he himself and the Minister for State-Owned Entities are actually held hostage by the labor unions. They can't move. If you look at the debt of government increasing to 4.5 trillion or 70% of the GDP by the end of this fiscal term, then we must say to each other, the government is in deep, deep trouble. He made some announcements to say that they will curb certain benefits from the executive. That really is a drop in the ocean because that is not going to solve the problem. Even if you look at the situation of the economic growth in South Africa, the average for sub-Saharan Africa is 3.6%, whereas they have adjusted it now in South Africa to 0.5%. So that tells you there is a major problem, and you can also see it in the figures of unemployment that has risen with more than 29% in South Africa. If you take the wider definition, more than 38%. There's one strong message from the Minister of Finance, and that is that the taxpayers of South Africa must brace themselves for next year's budget because they're going to increase the taxes because there is no other way that they will be able to get to finance all the debt of government, and that's a huge problem.
Just before I let you go, additional allocations for the National Prosecuting Authority as well as SARS to fight corruption. You must be pleased.
Yes, of course, because we have to ensure that we get all the revenue we can collect. And of course, I also said previously that if you look at crime in South Africa, the solution is to ensure that you make the whole criminal justice system stronger, which includes the National Prosecuting Authority. So yes, we welcome that. But in the end, if you look at the major picture, then we must say to each other, South Africa is in deep trouble.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pieter Groenewald from the Freedom Front Plus. I'm going to bring into the conversation now a leader of the AIC, Mr. Mandlenkosi Galo. This budget, a lot of talk about economics, but for the person in the street, do you think that the Department of Finance is heading in the right direction?
No, really, I don't think so. Because, for instance, the minister has delivered his budget speech when the unemployment figures sit at 29%. And the minister didn't touch on how the economy is going to be developed, more especially in the rural areas and in the township. Remember, we are above 25 years of democracy, but when you look the gap between the rural communities, your townships, and the urban areas, you will find that the gap is huge. However, we commend the minister for cutting down the spending, more especially on the part of your executive. And we support the fact that telephone bills in the ministers and deputy ministers must not go well above 5,000, and the cars that are being bought by the state must not be more than 700,000, because we need this money for it to go to our rural communities. And we are saying, in order to save money as a state, we must also consider the reduction of these provinces. Remember, we are having 9 provinces currently, and you are having your MECs, your premier, and these people are having a contingent kind of staff members. Then if you can reduce the provinces at least to 4 provinces, you will save that money and you can be able to service your debt, which is plus minus 3 trillion. Right.
All right, thank you so much, Mandla Ngosi Galo from the AIC. In the next conversation, I'm going to bring in the Honorable Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi, the Emeritus President of the IFP. Tatu Buthelezi, basically, the groundwork and the direction has been set by the Finance Minister. As the IFP, what's your take on that?
Well, I think that he was brutally honest. I think we should give him credit for that he didn't try to pull wool over our eyes. But it's high time South Africans realize that we're in a serious crisis in our country, and that we need something. All of us are in it. We either swim together or sink together.
Plans on fighting corruption?
Yes. I think that, of course, that is one of the major problems we have, the corruption that we have. The problem is mismanagement. Clearly, we're all celebrating our freedom, but it's quite clear that we've not managed our country as we should. And in fact, I don't see why we should have been so, relaxed about the state-owned enterprises. Because I heard even today from the chairperson of Scopa that even the Express airline is going to be bailed out with 300 billion today. It's amazing that while the minister has stated clearly that we are spending more money than we're spending money we don't have, but we still have money to bail out. I mean, it's a contradiction.
All right, thank you so much, Prince Mangosuthu Buthelezi, the Emeritus President of the IFP. We'll now link back to Arabile in studio.
Bulelani, thank you so much for that. Yeah, I am joined in studio now by Colin Coleman, the Chief Executive Officer of Goldman Sachs South Africa. Colin, thank you so much for the time. Does this garner perhaps some helpful interest from the investment community, do you reckon? Did this MTBPS reassure you?
Well, what will stand out is the powerful warning that the Minister of Finance gave to Parliament and to South Africa as a whole, that unless the rising costs of government are brought down relative to the income that it's getting through the tax system, that we are going to get into an unsustainable set of fiscal ratios. And so we have to get expenditure under control and we have to get growth going. And without both happening, South Africa faces the potential situation that he called a debt trap into the future. So we have to take this warning that he's issued very seriously, and as a country and as a government, work out very detailed mechanics of bringing expenditure under control and getting growth going.
Yeah, he did make note of how much he plans to support Eskom with over the next 10 years or so, plus minus around 230 billion rand odd. And those are just continued support measures for it, but it needs to start functioning on its own. How clear, how important and how decisive was a message like that as well? And did it perhaps send the right message as well to the investment community that we are serious about making sure that Eskom stands on its own 2 feet?
Well, the questions from the investment community will be, this is a second or a third in a series of warnings about the state of state-owned enterprises from Minister Mboweni
to his counterpart, Minister Gordon, about the drain that the state-owned enterprises represent on the fiscus. And we've seen, I would say, limited action insofar as stopping the bleeding of the impact of state-owned enterprises on the fiscus in the real economy. So I think there are attempts by President Ramaphosa and his team to bring the state-owned enterprises into the right zone. But we haven't yet seen the practical benefits of that. And so hopefully this is kind of near the bottom, and we need to see the wheels start to turn for the better.
Finally, very last thing, what do you feel may have been missing from this medium-term budget policy statement?
That's difficult to say, there's because we haven't had time to study the documents, but the speech itself was a very high level, as I say, warning shot. There wasn't a clear set of specifics about how they are going to bring these expenditures down, but he did identify the themes, SOEs, public wages, and others, where the target is going to be focused. And I think that was probably sufficient for now. We will want to see the detail in order to evaluate it.
Colin, appreciate the time. Thank you so much for that. Colin Coleman there from Goldman Sachs South Africa, Chief Executive Officer then of Goldman Sachs Sub-Saharan Africa. Thank you so much for that. We'll cross back then to my colleague Bulelani Philip on the steps of Parliament, and hopefully right after that we'll be joined then by the Deputy Minister of Finance as we get to unpack that MTBPS further. Bulelani.
Well, thanks so much once again, Arabile. We'll continue to take the reactions. We now bring in the PAC, the leader of the PAC, Mr. Mboweni. So, for the poor, is there anything that they can take out of this mini budget?
Really nothing. There is nothing new. There's nothing for the poor. And of the most concern is the unbundling of Eskom, which is anyway privatization. And Eskom must remain a state enterprise. And I don't know why is it difficult for these guys to allow consumers to buy electricity directly from Eskom instead of buying it via municipalities. Anyway, the municipalities are the reasons why Eskom is always asking for bailouts, because they don't pay the debts. So that's the problem. So poor will always suffer.
If there's only one economic reform that you would have liked to see, what would it be?
It would be an economy that is pro-poor, an economy where the state is in charge of all state enterprises, not the private investors. Remember, if you privatize, the business people are going to look for profit, maximum profit. And if it is under the state, then it is going to be better for the poor to access these things. So if the state is not nationalizing the strategic aspects of the economy, the poor will remain poor and nothing will change.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Mboweni from the PAC. I'm now going to bring a voice of the workers from COSATU, Matthew Parks, who is the parliamentary councillor for COSATU. Matthew, again, the thorny issue of the wage bill and it being cut down. The minister making some strides and saying that that needs to come down. Your thoughts?
Look, as COSATU, we reject any attack upon workers. He's basically blaming nurses and teachers, police officers who earn very little money, 200,000 rand, for the wage bill. We can't blame people who want to take care of the family. He must rather look at the 10% of the budget that we lose every year to corruption. That's 150 billion rand, to wasteful expenditure. He's not touched upon the departments which have failed to spend the budgets that we saw today. He's not even touching upon the fact that a third of the wage bill is actually from management, from ministers, from executive directors, from the DGs. He's not proposing any cuts there. Yet he wants to blame nurses who want to take care of the families. So for us, it's a huge problem. He should also rather look at tax evasion, people who don't pay their taxes, the wealthy in particular, and deal with the issues of corruption in Eskom. We're not arresting those who have stolen, yet we want to go after nurses and teachers who earn a small amount of money. So for us, the minister's not being honest. He's being disingenuous, and we'll deal with him at the Public Service Bargaining Council if he comes there.
All right, thank you so much. Matthew Parks is the parliamentary councillor for COSATU. In this conversation, I'm going to bring in now the leader of the Congress of the People, Ndate Musiwale Kota. Basically, the minister laying out a lot of economic reforming strategies. Do you think it will take us in the right direction?
Well, certainly he's begun to touch on the nerve centers that need to be touched on. He will, of course, in 3 months' time, he will then propose firm steps that must be taken. we must recognize the fact that we cannot continue to emphasize consumption, paying a lot of money to large numbers of South Africans, but who are not in productive industries. You need people to be employed to work the land. You need people to be in all of these productive industries so that we can export things, etc., etc. And so that you can attract not only South African investors, but also investors from abroad. Now, as long as we threaten to take people's properties, we are making it impossible for investors to invest and employ all these unemployed people. Once the people are employed, they will then pay their tolls. They will then be able to spend the money that they earn because they are here. If you don't do that, you're letting them sit on the side of the streets, and then they cannot pay the tolls. Then they cannot spend the money because you are not paying them. And then what you are doing, you are grinding the economy to a dead still. When he begins to say, we will no longer give you bailouts, you must borrow the money and invest it productively so that you can pay your debts and so on. Now that is the right step to go in. Instead of keep giving free money, give free money, and then it's finished, then they come back for more money and so on. The purpose for state-owned enterprises is so that they make profits and contribute to the fiscus. If they are no longer making profits, close them down.
All right, Mr. Musiwali Kota, leader of the Congress of the People, giving us his views and what they expected from this mini budget. For now, we'll cross back to you, Arabile, and we'll take more action when you're done.
Thank you, Bulelani Philip, there, of course, on the steps of Parliament. I am joined in our studio now by the Deputy Finance Minister, that's Mr. David Masondo, then joining us here. Thank you so much for the time. Really, really appreciate it, bruv. You've heard some of the sentiments and the comments then coming through from the steps of Parliament, the likes of Musiwali Kota, Kosatu as well, really feeling that the Minister has been a bit disingenuous. Perhaps your thoughts and your comments on that?
I think it's important to start by saying that we presented this budget at MTBPS within a very tight financial constraints. Notwithstanding that, we're still committed to providing financing, education, health, social grants, as well as its infrastructure. However, we're concerned about three rising expenditure items: wage bill, SOEs, and the debt service cost, the interest that we're paying to the debt that we owe. And insofar as the wage bill is concerned, the Minister has laid it out there that we'll be engaging with all the people who get income in the form of salary, wages, bonuses across the state to start to have a conversation on how we can cut that. It's not just nurses, all of us who get income from the state. We need to seriously have a conversation on how we can moderate the increase insofar as salaries and wage bills are concerned. It was very clear that insofar as the SOEs, we cannot, because many of them we know that they cannot meet their financial obligations. Sure. However, entities such as Eskom, the problem is not money. You can recapitalize, you can bail out Eskom year in, year out, but as long as you will not deal with the cost drivers, the revenue will not be able to deal with the problem. Minister Gordhan, yesterday, he presented a paper which attempt to deal with both the cost drivers of Eskom as well as revenue. Because throwing money into the problem is not sustainable. And it's for that reason that we also said that we can no longer continue to give equity injection to these SOEs. We've got to make sure that we give them loans. And we'll also go through all of them, all the state entities, not just at the national level, but also the local and the provincial level, and ask one question only. It's your state-owned entity growth enhancing or is draining the fiscus? And if it's draining the fiscus, we've got to close it down.
Sure. Are you in support, though, of the plan that the Minister of Public Enterprises has put forward yesterday? Is National Treasury in support of that plan, and then saying that they will back the plan in whatever possible way within, of course, the confines of the fiscus?
Oh, of course, we developed the plan together with them. National Treasury as well as the Department of Public Enterprise. There have been a lot of consultations and conversations with them on ESCOM paper. And I think we are also happy that they will also be sorting out the governance issues.
Sure.
We've been advised that very soon they'll be announcing the appointment of a CEO for ESCOM.
Yeah. Minister, Deputy Minister, I'm going to ask if you could please stay with us and perhaps hear the words then, and perhaps some thoughts from the EFF as well, from the steps of Parliament. My colleague Bulelani Philip is standing by with them.
Right, thanks once again, Arabile. In this conversation, I'm bringing in the Chief Whip of the EFF, Mr. Floyd Shibambu. You came in here with a lot of proposals in terms of how to turn the economy around. In your view, has the Minister delivered?
No, he has not said anything that is new and is cogent in terms of what we should do to turn around the economy in South Africa. You know, we have got a huge crisis in South Africa of poverty, of inequalities, but of even deeper crisis of unemployment, of rising unemployment. And the rising unemployment comes out of the declining jobs in the manufacturing sector. There is no economy anywhere in the world that sustains growth and becomes much more dependable in terms of job creation without focusing on industrialization, and in particular in the manufacturing sector. So there's nothing that is believable that was said by the Minister in relation to industrial and trade policy in terms of how are we going to, one, stop the jobs that are being lost now from being lost further, but also to create more jobs in the manufacturing and industrial space. And that is the failure of everything else. You can't build an economy based on cosmetic austerity measures that he announced today there. An economy is built through industry. That is the only way to build an economy. And the Minister of Finance never spoke anything about that. So there is this excitement about macroeconomics or fiscal policy and monetary policy, but there is no clearer focus on the microeconomics of how do you drive industry, how do you support small and medium enterprises so that they are the core of economic activity in South Africa. How do you strategically substitute some of the imports that are coming into South African economy and domestically build a manufacturing capacity that is going to make sure that as many people as possible are employed, that is going to broaden your revenue base. The Minister of Finance never spoke about any of those aspects. So as the EFF are not inspired or not even convinced about what he said today, he was not inspired at all.
Before I let you go, a pronouncement of R1 billion for SARS to fight illicit financial flows?
Look, there's been lots of nominal commitments and made around the fight against illicit financial flows, tax base erosion and profit shifting. And our insistence is that you have to enact a legislation first that forbids tax avoidance, that forbids profit shifting. But now we do not have a proper legislative framework in the South African Parliament and in South Africa that deals with those aspects. That is why, as part of the interventions in this 6th Parliament, we are going to reintroduce the anti-tax avoidance bill as the EFF, which must be turned into an act of Parliament. And in that way, we can guarantee South Africa that we'll create an additional 100 billion rand in revenue so that we can be able to make interventions in social services, in education, in healthcare and social development in general. But currently there is no proper foundation legislatively to fight illicit financial flows because the ANC government has been negligent in the manner in which it deals with this issue. And it is doing so because it is their friends who are involved in illicit financial flows and tax-based erosion. So they close one eye deliberately because they do not want to tamper out the profits of their friends in the capitalist establishment.
All right, Mr. Floyd Shibambu, the Chief Whip of the EFF, giving us this party's views. For now, Arabile, we'll cross back to you, studio.
Bulelani, thank you so much for that. Of course, as I said a little bit earlier, still joined by the Deputy Finance Minister, David Masondo. Mr. Masondo, you've heard the sentiments of the EFF's Floyd Shibambu. Your thoughts, perhaps?
I think the minister, or what he presented today, we made it very clear that if we can't grow this economy, it's going to be very difficult for us to raise revenue. It's going to be very difficult to generate employment. And we've released a discussion document on economic strategy. And amongst other things that we're saying in that document, there's a pillar which we call reimagined industrial strategy, which is aimed at making sure that we support and rebuild the manufacturing sector, to make sure that the manufacturing sector's contribution to the GDP grows significantly. Because 1994, the manufacturing sector's contribution to GDP was 24%. It has significantly gone down now to 12%, 13%. And we're saying that it's important for us to focus in that area. And there are detailed plans. And we've done a lot insofar as the certain industry, like the automotive industry, and making sure that we increase the local content. And secondly, many of the procurement, the kind of procurement that we do, we emphasize that there must be localization, e.g. procurement of buses, procurement of rail stock for Transnet, PRASA. We've been pushing very hard that there has to be local content. Secondly, we've said for us to grow this economy, it's important to break the barriers to entry for SMMEs. Barriers to entry ranging from skills, finance, infrastructure. And in breaking the barriers to entry for SMMEs to get in, it's not a question of doing away with big business or big companies. It's about the articulation between the two.
Yeah.
Where does a big company source some of its services, goods from? They must source them from the local. And the third point is that in the document that we've released, which is receiving a lot of support, we've said that it's important for us to look at infrastructure, what we've termed network industries, telecommunication, electricity, water, which the minister has articulated in this MTBBS statement.
Very finally, I have to ask Mr. Masondo, do you think this was enough to stave off a downgrade, even if it is to our credit outlook? Of course, Moody's does come out with their sentiments and their rating on South Africa on Friday.
We've done our best to really put our policy positions on this. And secondly, to demonstrate that we do have institutions that work, the institutions that are very conducive for attracting and retaining and attracting new investment. Next week, we'll also be showing case the kind of conducive environment that we have in South Africa to increase the investment rates.
Yeah. Are you in discussion with the ratings agencies today by any chance, or within the next few hours?
Our teams are in conversation with them, and we've been in conversation with them. They've raised concern, and some of the concern that they've raised, we've tried our best to basically deal with them. The wage bill, issues around ESCOM, and the rise of our debt. We've really tried our best to basically incorporate many of the concerns that they have.
Mr. Masondo, thank you so much for the time. Really appreciate it. Thank you for joining us here on SABC News. The Deputy Finance Minister then as well, joining us right here in studio in Parliament, of course, right after the Finance Minister delivered that medium-term budget policy statement 2019. Let's head back then to the steps of Parliament. My colleague Bulelani Philip still there with some reaction.
Well, thanks, Arabile. We're still taking a wide range of reactions, both politically and civil society. For the moment being, I'm going to be speaking to the president of the political party, Al Jamaa, which has one seat in the National Assembly, Mr. Muhammad Hendricks. Basically, this mini budget for you, does it bring investor and business confidence in order to create jobs?
No, I don't think so, because the big problem is that South Africa is broke at the moment, and that our spending patterns will soon exceed the revenue that is generated in the country, and that will not give investors the necessary confidence. At the same time, what is very worrying is that the Minister of Finance did not put the trade unions on terms that when it comes to February, there may be no increases for them, because the country can't afford to increase the public salary bill. Also, the Minister of Finance has appointed the women of South Africa. They were looking forward to listening how the 1 billion rand to combat violence against women will be consolidated, because at the moment the 1 billion is spread amongst 20 different government departments, and one would have expected that it will be consolidated into one line item. The investors are obviously looking at the screams of women that violence against women needs to be addressed, and I don't think that they would want to invest in such an environment. Also, one of the president talked about the district models, where the 3 tiers of government, that the budgets that they have will be consolidated in the districts, and one would then have a lot of economic opportunities in these districts, but the Minister of Finance did not prepare the country that something is going to be done about that come February.
I'm sorry, we're going to have to leave it there. We've got a couple of people to get through. Mr. Muhammad Hendricks, thank you so much for your time. He is, of course, the leader of the Al-Jama. I'm going to bring into conversation now where a spokesperson of the ruling party, Mr. Dakota Lechwete, who has been standing by. Mr. Lechwete, thank you so much for joining us. The policy reforms announced by the finance minister, do you think they will take us out of this economic crisis that we face?
Yes, indeed. As the African National Congress, we welcome the statement by the minister. It is consistent with what we have resolved as a movement, that as part of the turnaround strategy on our economic challenges, one of the things that is being identified as a problem, it was the ESCOM, energy security and energy supply. And so far we are happy that it will go out to have 3 subsidiaries, but the ownership of that particular entity still remains with the state, which is very good. What would be getting is private-public partnerships and build operator transfer in the form of equities, which can be from the public, which can be from direct foreign investments, and some of them is what we are looking at, because the major thing that is very important is to have energy security, because for our economy to contract and do bad in the past, where we lost minus 3.2%, was highly through the energy security.
But the question though is ESCOM going to be privatized from the ANC's point of view?
No, we have not agreed on privatization. What we have agreed is that we'll have 3 subsidiaries, with one which is transmission being wholly 100% owned by the state, and the other 2 getting equity partners. So that's what we are looking at. And obviously we don't want privatization for the sake of privatization, because you can't have an institution and a company like ESCOM, which was working effectively, all of a sudden having challenges, and the quickest decision we have to make is to privatize in a country where more than 10 million people are unemployed, where more than 17 million people are living on grants. It's not quite fair and consistent. But we're also happy that government is committed to build and put up more spending on infrastructure development. I think for just this financial year, they're putting aside over 500 billion rand. I think that's enough amount of money to kickstart and resuscitate the project of turning around the economy and ensuring that we are on a growth path again. They are putting aside certain amount on tourism and other related infrastructure issues, including 1.1 billion rand on SARS, 1.3 billion rand on NPA, as part of our efforts to show that we do not pay a lip service to the fight against corruption and state of capture, but we are putting up efforts, including finances and resources. And that particular money of 1.3 billion, it will also assist us on fighting gender-based violence. Because that particular schedule...
Before I let you go, I do want to touch on the issue of the relations between the ruling party as well as the alliance partners, particularly around the pronouncements of this economic transformation paper presented by National Treasury, as well as the pronouncements of reducing the wage bill of government.
Look, you would understand, we are living in a free market economy. We are living in a global world economy. That's why countries like China, they did not solely rely on socialism and communism. they brought in something called socialism with Chinese characteristics as part of the reform and the restructuring processes, but not running away from creating a middle class, not running away from defeating poverty. By 2020, there will be no poverty in China. And today, out of 1.4 billion Chinese citizens, 520 million of them are millionaires. We can work out from such models without hating capital, because we need capital to resuscitate our economy. We need capital to ensure that our kids have a future. We need capital to ensure that we build infrastructure and other related issues. And it's for all of us in the Alliance and the ANC to smell the coffee and wake up, because we can't rely on old methods which would not be implementable today. Even though we don't run away from the ideological base, we need to deal with the current challenges.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Dakota Legwete. He is, of course, the spokesperson of the African National Congress. On that note, for now, Arabile, I'm going to throw it back to you in studio.
Bulelani, thank you so much for that. I am joined this time around as well by Elna Mulman, economist then at Standard Bank, and she joins us for some reaction as well. Elna, thank you so much for the time. Your thoughts? I mean, did it cover everything? Yes, there was a large section on Eskom, but did it actually put any lights on for you?
I think, unfortunately, this is one of those times when it's basically just saying to us, if we don't take steps from here, then the outcomes will be ABC. So if we look at the debt trajectory, for example, it's an absolutely shocking picture. But now the difficulty is in saying we'll only get there if we don't take action. And the question is, how much action will we actually take? So unfortunately, this still kind of leaves us in limbo. We were all hoping that after this week we would know.
Exactly, but that's what I was saying there, that perhaps it gives them so much leeway to perhaps just act within whatever ambit they have and hope for the best at the end of that. Does this perhaps hold them accountable in any way? I certainly don't think so.
Yeah. So I think what this is basically just Treasury's way of giving government the ammunition to say we can no longer delay some of the tough decisions. You've mentioned Eskom, and that's one part. And I do think on Eskom we're at least starting to make progress, right? So we've had the release of that paper this week. And from a market perspective, we may look at that and say you don't do enough to address the immediate liquidity issues, etc. But at the same time, I think what they're trying to do is the right things from a longer term perspective. So on Eskom's side, I think they're steadily making progress. The question is more on the fiscal side, whether government will actually be able to implement. Treasury vaguely refers to about 150 billion rands worth of interventions. That's a lot. And if you look at the composition and the things that they refer to, it's kind of wage bill and sale of non-core assets. And these are difficult decisions to make.
Debt to most likely exceed 70% of GDP by 2022-2023. When we were shocked not so long ago, and I think Finance Minister Malusi Gigaba stood here at the MTBPS that year and raised the picture to around 64-65%, we were absolutely shocked. 70% comes out, kind of expected.
I think this was worse than anybody expected. And I still hope that when we get to the budget next year, they will actually improve the picture. In other words, they will take some of the steps. The problem is that they probably won't be able to take all of the steps that they think is necessary. And sometimes the 70% sounds a little bit abstract, but I think the way to look at this is to say we're now spending more on debt servicing costs than on total social grants. So clearly there's something wrong with this picture.
Where do we fix the disconnect, though? I mean, and I say that because, yes, we've been given this MTBPS, which is supposed to aid the resolution of some of South Africa's problems at present and perhaps into the future. And yes, fine, it doesn't have major tax pronouncements, but what it should have is a formulaic pathway. And perhaps some might get lost in the mire of where exactly we stand. We say we no longer can accept certain things, but we haven't said what we are going to do to ensure that they don't happen anymore.
Yes. I think to some extent Treasury is just saying, we can do the calculations and we can do the funding for you, etc. But the difficult decisions around government wage bill that needs to be managed, for example, that needs to be negotiated elsewhere, and they can only deal with the consequences. I have to say they have done reasonably well on the expenditure side to contain general costs. They've cut the spending on general goods and services, etc. So I think there we have to give Treasury a little bit of credit. But unfortunately, the big decisions still have to be made, and they're not made by Treasury, and there's not much time left before the budget to make these decisions.
It really, really isn't. 150 billion in terms of savings over the next 3 years. where do you find 50 billion to cut off over the next 3 years if you already have, for example, made sure that salaries of cabinet officials, MECs and the likes are stagnant and moving backwards, stipends, cell phones, cars, all of those costs already within this fiscus are just kept under wraps, if not going backwards, hopefully. Where then will you find an extra 50 billion every year over the next 3 years?
I think it would still, a major element of that would have to come from the general government wage bill. And so, for example, if we look over the last, let's say, 10 years, then the increases in the government wage bill was well ahead of the private sector. So the private sector, you can get away with excessive increases 1 year or two, but not for a sustained period. And we have now started seeing this disconnect, and it would simply have to be addressed. Unfortunately, in this year's budget, government proposed early retirement packages, and the hope was that that would be taken up, and we haven't seen that. So basically what we've said is that promise now carries over, and we have to negotiate around that. Plus now we have a much bigger negotiation to make as well. But I think ultimately it's just going to say we have spent beyond our means for quite some time immediately after the global financial crisis, and everybody is now going to feel some pain. So we focused quite a bit in our discussion on the government wage bill that needs to be addressed. But tax increases, I think, is also unfortunately going to be inevitable. There's already 10 billion coming.
Where?
I think, unfortunately, a big part of it is still going to be on the consumer side. So I think fiscal drag will definitely be there, and it will be meaningful. So that just means that the tax brackets are not adjusted in line with inflation. So actually then it starts eating into your real disposable income. So that, I think, is going to happen. And we're already seeing that consumers are under significant pressure and debt arrears are rising, etc. So I think we'll see a little bit more of that next year.
Well, unlike the sun out here in Cape Town, you've painted an even more bleak picture. But Elna, thank you so much for the time. Really appreciate it. Elna Moolman, economist at Standard Bank, then joining us here in studio as we get some more of how exactly budget MTBPS has sort of looked out and what exactly the forecast even is, perhaps over the next 2 to 3 years odd as well. Let's cross on over to the steps of Parliament. My colleague Bulelani Phillips getting some reaction as well.
Well, Arabile, we're going to be taking some reaction from the Progressive Professionals Forum just to check around the issues of this exclusive economy. I'm going to bring into the conversation Azania Matiwane, who is from the PPF. The minister's pronouncements is obviously not speaking to numbers and details, but as the PPF, are you hopeful that this kind of strategy that is undertaking will be bringing an inclusive and competitive economy?
Our view is simple. First of all, in 2017, you would know that the shortfall of about 50 billion rands was encountered by under Minister Malusi Gigaba. The very same situation has arisen in this current midterm budget policy statement, which simply says that there's a number of things that have happened. One of them is that there's an increase in unemployment, meaning the revenue base has decreased. And government spending has increased, meaning that government has been spending money that they don't have, and that is why they're borrowing more. So there's a need that we need to look at, first of all, the issue of infrastructural spending, which is a positive thing that government has taken care of it now. But the other thing that is happening is that there is an absence of serious looking at cutting the fat around the issue of spending on public service, more especially around the issue of compensation. So we are hopeful that maybe in February we are going to be opening our eyes and looking at what are the policy measures that are going to be proposed so that to cut the issue of the fat, because so far there's not been real actions and policy decisions towards cutting the fat around the issue of spending in public services.
This issue of the wage bill keep coming up around the issue of creating acrimonious relations between government as the employer as well as labor. I mean, it leads to prolonged strikes, which also in turn affects the economy. How do we get out of that conundrum?
Look, we must bear in mind, those who are employed are that far, they're just the minority of those that are unemployed. We need to look at how do we get those that are unemployed to be able to get into the tax revenue-based system. And if we cannot be able to do that, that simply means that we need to take some serious political decisions, and the ruling party needs to take this thing very serious, whereby we need to look at what serious political decisions we can be able to take so that we can employ more people, so that they can be able to get into contributing tax-wise. At the moment, there's fewer people sustaining the majority, and that's unsustainable. And so that is a hard decision that the ruling party will have to look at, and the decision that they will have to take, and that is a policy decision.
Lastly, before I let you go, the issue of the infrastructure fund, there's talk of a 500 billion pipeline investments. Are you guys involved in any of those?
At the moment, no, we're not. But we believe that government should spend its way out of the current financial situation. And they can only do that if they can be able to spend on capital-intensive markets like your farming and all those things. But also the other thing that we need to do is to spend on infrastructure, improve our infrastructure, employ more people so that we can be able to improve the issue of unemployment.
Thank you so much, Azania Matiwane, who is from the Progressive Professionals Forum, wrapping up all the reactions here in front of the steps of the National Assembly. On that note, Arabile, it's back to you in studio.
Bulelani, thank you so much for that, helping us, of course, cover all the reaction we could possibly get on the steps of Parliament after that medium-term budget policy statement then by the Finance Minister, Tito Mboweni, having been delivered a little bit earlier on. As we continue to wrap up and close things off, we are then joined here in studio by Christy Viljoen from PwC and Bernard Sachs then from Mazars as they join us here as well. Gentlemen, thank you so much. I suppose I'll get a quick reaction from both of you just with regards to that speech. Christy, happy? Unhappy?
Happy with some parts, but we're always happy with some parts and unhappy with others.
Yeah.
Some of the numbers look terrible, but I think it's reminding me of the budget statement we had 2 years ago where they did something similar, where they sort of put everything on the table and said, this is how bad it could get if we can't get things sorted out. And so many pages on pages in that document said, wait for Feb, wait for Feb. Yeah. So a few more months and maybe a few more things are sorted out. So I'm just hoping that the next round of numbers can look better from this.
Aren't we tired of that, though? Aren't we tired of just getting the notion of, let's wait for next one. Let's wait for February to get a clearer picture, more detail. We wanted more detail now. We didn't get the detail. We're going to wait for February again. It's getting a little exhausting.
Oh, yes. We're very tired of that. I think because we've been kicking this bucket for so long, that's why this economy is not growing. We're looking at 5-6 years of very low growth. It's because we can't sort these things out. So I'm not enthusiastic about the fact that we're moving away to next year, waiting again and again. Yeah. At least there is some progress, certainly not enough. In that sense, it's very disappointing. Our economy is not going to be much better off tomorrow than it was today before the speech.
Sure, that's certainly going to be true. Mr. Sachs, your thoughts on that MTBPS?
I agree that there was a lot of honesty about the problem. However, I think there was a lot more that I would like to have heard about what is going to be done to rectify the shortcomings. And I agree as well that there was a lot of deferral to February. And I don't believe that we can afford to wait until February. The time for action is now. And in fact, I would have liked the Minister to have actually reported to us that over the past 4 or 5 months, this is what has been done and these are the results that have been achieved. But all that has happened is he's laid it bare that we're in deep trouble. The economy has contracted, collections are down, the expenditure is up. But all in all, it's quite a bleak picture.
And I mean, we've known all of that, right? We have known that we certainly are in a bleak scenario. Growth of 0.5% for this year, that's not unexpected either, right? But it's not where we should be.
No, that's correct. And for the first 2 quarters, we were up, I think 3.5%. Sorry, I beg your pardon. We were down 3.5% in the first quarter and up 3.5% in the second quarter. So we're flat for the year to date, and they're anticipating the last 2 quarters to deliver growth of a combined 0.5%, and we're projected to growth of I think it's 1.7% in 2022-2023. If you look at countries slightly north of us, you look at Ghana, you look at Ethiopia, their economies are booming. What is going wrong? We're blessed with natural resources. We're blessed with natural beauty, and I believe we need to be exporting And we need to be finding ways to beneficiate the minerals that we draw out of the ground rather than exporting the raw minerals or the raw ore.
Yeah. Look, it's easy to be negative also then, Christy, isn't it? And in a time when things are going so bad as, like I said earlier, 70% of GDP, that's just our debt scenario. Our national debt exceeded 3 trillion and is expected to rise to 4.5 trillion over the next 3 years. Consolidated budget deficit, 5.9% of GDP in the current year, rising to around 6.5, 6.6% odd as well. It's easy to be negative. Where are the bright spots, the green shoots that former Finance Minister Pravin Gordhan used to speak about?
Okay, let's think of maybe 2 positive points to mention. The one is, I think there's another line in the sand that Eskom has been given, where they've basically been told, you're not going to get bailouts, you can get loans, but you have to get your house in order. So we need to see evidence that things are turning around there. The other point that I'm actually quite happy with is with the comment on goods and services spending that's going to be declining by an average of 2%. Now, I know the finance minister said he wanted about 5. He requested other government departments a few months ago to look at cutting 5-6%. So 2 is at least something. It shows that there is willingness. The big barrier is just the wage bill. So I think there is some enthusiasm within some government departments to help the finance minister get things sorted out. And hopefully that builds into a bit more momentum. He's got the backing of the president. As soon as we get more people involved, then we can maybe turn around some of these ugly numbers and then look at a brighter future if we can get that sorted out.
Does it offer a more stern warning to government, to consumers as a whole as well? The fact that they decided to keep, if not reduce, the salaries of cabinet, MEC members, government officials in general, keep cars for officials at around 700k, VAT inclusive as well. All those little measures that they tried to put together. Does that send a stern enough message then that they are trying to curb that wage bill and they are trying to curb government spending a whole lot more?
It's good news, obviously, but it's an easy win, actually.
Yeah.
The president can quickly discuss that with cabinet. They agree and they implement it. Now it's in the speech. So that's an easy win. There's also not that much money to be saved. You'll save quite a few million rand, most definitely. But in the bigger picture, it is that more than 1 million state employees that are actually earning relatively high salaries when you compare that to the private sector. And to get those numbers down, I think the finance minister has a big fight on his hands with the labor unions. And then it gets tricky from a political perspective because labor and government has a very close relationship. So obviously very happy that we're looking at a leaner cabinet that's costing less. But the big challenge is that big public sector payroll.
Yeah, the fight, as he mentioned then, Mr. Sachs, is that it's certainly going to take some while. We spoke to Kusatu a little bit earlier on, and they're saying that you need to stop picking on people like the nurses and the likes of those who aren't earning as much, and instead you should be picking on the kinds of people that are taking home far too much money, in the range of the millions, as they noted in the speech a little bit earlier on. How long will this fight go on for, and how deep could it range for as well?
Well, I think that the minister has demonstrated his resolve to sort that out, but I sensed an element of frustration in the way the minister spoke about the state-owned enterprises and the extent of the rot that is evident there. And I think that as Christy indicated, the concept of a loan rather than a bailout is a good one, and it should hopefully make the senior management at these state-owned enterprises sit up and take note that they will be held accountable and they will be expected to repay, that there will be interest accruing on those loans, and it will form part of their budgets.
Yeah, fantastic. Gentlemen, thank you so much for the time. Really, really appreciate it. Thank you so much for joining us here on SABC News. That's Bernard Sachs from Mazars, and of course Christy Viljoen then as well from PwC. We'll continue to try and give you as much of a rundown of what exactly happened inside the National Assembly then as the Finance Minister Tito Mboweni delivered that medium-term budget policy statement. For now, we'll take a quick break. We'll be back with you right here in Cape Town right after this.